Let's talk about The Gunslinger by Stephen King. This is the first book in his Dark Tower series, his big epic fantasy series. So for him and many others in the 70s, this was his, and he would say so, his Lord of the Rings inspired series. Things like Sword of Shannara and Wheel of Time and Thomas Covenant. Those are other series that really come out of that same inspiration. It's interesting that these American responses, by the way, to the Lord of the Rings are so often post-apocalyptic in some sense. I hope this is not a spoiler for books that are often over 40 years old, but Shannara and Wheel of Time and The Gunslinger involve this idea of worlds that have significantly changed, that maybe used to be more like our worlds and are now in some way fantastic, or always were fantastic perhaps, but certainly are now. Thomas Covenant is a slightly different kind of thing. The Gunslinger is a Western fantasy. The whole Dark Tower series is not insanely super Western. There always has Western elements, but The Gunslinger is very much cast as a Western. The first there's a gunslinger. That's his title as well as what he does, and he is in a desert, and he there's everyone's hungry and thirsty because it's a desert. And he goes to a town where there's a ragtime saloon, and there's a church with a fire and brimstone preacher, things like that. There's this, generally speaking, this kind of vibe of a Western, but where it's not pioneering and frontiers work, it's things are disintegrating, and so you're on the frontier in that sense. But it has other elements, and I think you look at the contents, and so this is the kind of, there's no spoilers. I think if you read just the section titles, you're not allowed to say that spoilers. The Gunslinger, The Way Station, The Oracle and the Mountains, The Slow Mutants, The Gunslinger, and The Man in Black. Well, there are mutants. There are from the off, and increasingly kind of signs of, and Roland, our main character, will talk about this because he has come from a place where things used to work more than they do. In fact, where he comes from seems to have disappeared in some way. But the idea that technology, there's technology like our technology, but it doesn't work, or people don't know how to maintain it. There is a sense of living in a dark age, excuse me. But there's something magical going on as well because of in this decline, and it's not clear what that is. And we learn some more about that over the series, as you'd expect. This is one of my favourite series, the Dark Tower, and I'll make a video about why you should read the Dark Tower. But I think this itself is a good book. This is the first book, and I think this is the revised and expanded version, which basically, when he was coming back to publish the last 3 books, because he wrote them all at once and then he published them, he was like, the Gunslinger's always bothered me. There are things where I'm apologetic for it, and it doesn't fit completely. There are continuity errors, for instance, and there's a few things where I'm not really getting the point I want. And he's like, there's some young man errors in writing, and so he revised it. And I think it's still considered, it's good, but the drawing of the next book is where you go into high gear. However, I do think this is very good. I'm not sure if I strongly prefer the drawing of the 3 to this one, to the Gunslinger revised. I think it is just a fantastic book in terms of its core characters, its core world, the conflicts it sets up, and the action writing, and where there's action. King is a very good writer. He has a particular kind of laconic and stylized prose. It's both laconic and stylized, and he creates certain patterns of speech for Roland, where Roland's from. He does kind of have some extra words and some extra kind of, vocabulary, and there's that Tolkien-esque element, but that's not so strong. But there is this idea of pattern of speech and the way in which and that's something in the Dark Tower fandom, and in reading Dark Tower products, that you get a bit of this kind of, for D&D fans, a bit like Planescape. It's not anywhere near as intense as that, but this sense of a kind of a patois. King sets up this big quest inspired loosely by Robert Browning's poem Child Roll into the Dark Tower Came, and he is, here you have the last Gunslinger, Roland, going to find the Dark Tower because he has a quest there. He doesn't really know everything about it, but he knows that in some way he has a duty to deal with something there, and he's pursuing the man in black. You know, this one, the most famous opening lines in a series like this ever, and you probably have heard it even if you've not read the book. The man in black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed. This sense, this is a thing where Roland is still trying to work out. You know, he is badly damaged by things that have happened both before the fall of his homeland and, you know, in and since the fall of his homeland. He has a great quest. We know there's all these connections. Certainly, the poetry. You know, he doesn't have the Slughorn, but his friends are all, of the Dark Tower poem. But all his friends are the friends from that. You know, Alan and Cuthbert. He is in some way descended from Arthur Eld, who's some sort of King Arthur figure in the world he's from. So in that sense, the guns are his Excaliburs, aren't they? You know, they are this sort of connection to storied past. And so he is really an epic knight, you know. I remember, Childe Roland is probably connected really to the Charlemagne cycle rather than the French cycle rather than the British cycle with Arthur. But it's the same idea, the sense of this epic hero who, because it's 1970s America, naturally is cast as a Western gunslinger. That's a common trope in Westerns, you know, in the 60s and 70s. As you increasingly get a self-aware and cinematic view of the Western, often you have the gunslinger set up in Western films as either positively or negatively an epic figure. Roland is flawed and damaged, and he's dealing with a world which is very corrupt in every sense, and things are all mutated, and he's pursuing a wizard who just breaks and corrupts things, and this is in the second section, so it is, as it were, a mild spoiler, but it's not. It's basically just who the other main character in the book is functioning. It's a character called Jake who he meets, who becomes a big challenge to this, and this kind of monomaniacal and not quite cynical, but kind of seared conscience approach, because he has to deal with the fact there's this, young teenage boy, and like he can't just, he just can't switch himself off. It seems, he can't be like, oh, just leave the boy behind, and that's a really compelling relationship. And a lot of these, his pursuit of the man in black, his relationship with Jake, and some of the other things that happen in this book, either set up in terms of world building or set up in terms of plot and character, things that are going to happen throughout the series, core events and arcs and things like that. I greatly enjoy The Gunslinger. It's one of my favourite series, and so in that sense, it's a strong book within that. I think it's basically a series with 6 either strong or very strong books and 1 weak book, and this is, I think, a very good entry within that. So certainly, and it's not that long. It's 240 pages. So it does feel like, even if you're not sure about, I want to read all these other books, or I want to commit to that makes sense. Why would you commit to it? Just read this book and see what you think, and if you like it as a fantasy western, as an epic fantasy, as a character study, then yes, you can see whether you'll like the whole series. Anyway, if you have read it, tell me what you think in the comments, and I'll see you next time.